Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Today we're diving into one of the biggest geopolitical stories unfolding right now. President Donald Trump's push to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. There's been a lot of talk lately about Trump's upcoming meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin, his shifting position on Ukraine, and even the possibility of the U.S. supplying long-range Tomahawk missiles to Kyiv. Depending on who you ask, Trump is either on the verge of engineering a historic peace deal, or he's walking into a dangerous trap that could make things worse. So, what's actually going on here? Why is Trump suddenly at the center of the world's most volatile conflict again? And can he really stop a war that's dragged on for years and reshaped global politics? Let's break it all down. First, let's set the stage. The war in Ukraine has now gone far beyond what most people imagined when Russia launched its full-scale invasion back in 2022. What was supposed to be a quick military operation turned into a brutal, grinding war of attrition. Russia occupies a significant part of eastern and southern Ukraine, while Ukrainian forces, armed by the US and NATO allies, continue to resist and occasionally push back. But neither side has achieved a decisive victory. The human toll has been staggering. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers have been killed or wounded on both sides. Cities have been destroyed, and millions of civilians have been displaced. In Washington, support for Ukraine remains politically charged. The Biden administration has consistently backed Kyiv with weapons, financial aid, and intelligence support. But critics, especially in the Republican Party, argue that the U.S. has poured in too much money for too little progress, and that it's time for diplomacy, not more weapons. And that's where Donald Trump enters the picture. When Trump first took office in his second term, many people expected him to continue his previous America First foreign policy, skeptical of endless wars and hesitant to spend American resources abroad. In his early months, that seemed to be the case. Reports say that during his February meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House, Trump pushed hard for a ceasefire. His tone was reportedly blunt, even harsh. He suggested that Ukraine should consider freezing the conflict, maybe even accepting the loss of some territory in exchange for peace. That moment sparked outrage in Washington and Europe. Critics accused Trump of pressuring the victim instead of confronting the aggressor, of rewarding Vladimir Putin's invasion instead of punishing it. But here's the interesting twist. Over the past several months, Trump's stance has quietly but noticeably shifted. Now he's talking about helping Ukraine recover all its lost territories, including Crimea, something he avoided mentioning before. He's also expressed support for providing advanced U.S. weapons, such as long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles, though he insists he doesn't want to escalate the conflict. It's a striking reversal, one that raises a big question. What changed? To understand this shift, we need to look at both politics and strategy. Politically, Trump wants to prove that he can succeed where others failed. The Biden administration has struggled to deliver a clear endgame for the war. Trump, who prides himself on being a deal-maker, sees an opportunity to show the world that he can bring peace on his own terms. Strategically, Trump's calculus might be that Putin has overplayed his hand. Russia's war machine is exhausted, its economy is under pressure, and its global isolation has deepened. Meanwhile, Ukraine's drone attacks on Russian oil facilities have started to hurt, not just militarily, but economically. By signaling that he's willing to arm Ukraine more aggressively, Trump could be trying to pressure Putin back to the negotiating table. The classic speak softly and carry a big stick approach, except with tomahawks instead of a stick. At the same time, Trump seems to believe he can use the leverage of diplomacy, maybe even personal chemistry, to get Putin to compromise. Whether that's realistic or not is another question. The next big development is Trump's plan to meet Putin again, this time in Budapest, Hungary. That location isn't random. Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, has long maintained close ties with Moscow. He's also one of Trump's most vocal supporters in Europe. Budapest is symbolically neutral ground, not Moscow, not Washington, and it gives both leaders a way to meet without appearing to bow to the other. According to reports, Trump and Putin have already had several phone calls to lay the groundwork. Trump even posted online during one of those calls saying he was talking to President Putin right now, which gave the impression that progress toward peace might be underway. If the meeting happens, it could be a turning point or a diplomatic mirage. Putin, buoyed by support from China and North Korea, might see the meeting as a chance to buy time or divide the West. Trump, on the other hand, could be hoping to claim a foreign policy win ahead of the 2025 election cycle, showing he can manage crises better than Biden ever did. The big unknown is what each side is actually willing to give up. While Trump and Putin grab the headlines, Europe is quietly recalibrating. At a recent NATO defense ministers' meeting in Brussels, the U.S. and its allies agreed to expand support for Ukraine, not just with more weapons, but through a new financing model. Instead of the U.S. carrying most of the cost, European nations will now buy American-made weapons and send them to Ukraine themselves. It's a smart economic move for the U.S. The American defense industry profits, while the financial burden spreads across NATO. But it also sends a clear signal. Washington expects Europe to take more responsibility for its own security. This is a significant change from the Biden years, when the U.S. was often criticized for blank check aid to Ukraine. Under Trump, the approach seems more transactional. We'll help, but you'll pay. It's classic Trump economics applied to global security. Still, there's a risk here. If Europe perceives the U.S. as retreating or turning inward, it could weaken the unity that's kept NATO strong since the invasion began. Putin has always hoped to exploit such divisions. So while this new model of burden sharing might make sense financially, it also tests the political glue holding the Western alliance together. Beyond the battlefield, another war is raging: the energy war. Russia's economy runs on oil and gas. Cutting off those revenues has been a central goal of Western sanctions. But enforcing that goal is much harder than it sounds. Countries like India, China, and even Japan have continued buying Russian energy, sometimes indirectly, sometimes through intermediaries. Those purchases keep Putin's war chest alive. Trump recently claimed that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi agreed to stop buying Russian oil, a claim that so far hasn't been publicly confirmed. Indian officials have stayed quiet, likely because they're trying to balance cheap energy needs with geopolitical pressure from Washington. Trump's next goal, according to reports, is to push China to do the same, to stop buying Russian oil altogether. That, of course, is a much tougher sell. China and Russia have deepened their economic and strategic ties, with Beijing becoming Moscow's most important trade partner since the war began. But Trump seems to believe that pressure can work. His logic is that if both India and China reduce purchases, Russia's revenues would collapse, forcing Putin to negotiate. The idea makes sense on paper, but in reality, it's complicated. India and China buy Russian oil because it's cheap and available. Convincing them to give that up would require major economic incentives or new energy alternatives, neither of which can be arranged overnight. Even Japan, a U.S. ally, has struggled with this issue. It still imports Russian liquefied natural gas due to supply constraints. So while Trump's approach sounds tough, the global energy market doesn't always follow political orders. Here's where the plot thickens. After China's Victory Day military parade, referred to as the 9/3 parade in Chinese commentary, Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang began describing themselves as a strategic brotherhood. Not long after that, China made a surprising financial move. It allowed Russia to issue sovereign bonds, known as panda bonds, on Chinese markets. These are government bonds denominated in yuan, with unusually high interest rates reportedly reaching 18%. In theory, this lets Moscow raise funds directly from Chinese investors, bypassing Western sanctions. In practice, though, It's risky. If the Russian government collapses or defaults, those bonds could become worthless. Most large Chinese banks, wary of secondary U.S. sanctions, have reportedly declined to handle them. Only smaller banks, already on Western watch lists, appear willing to participate. Still, the political signal is clear. Beijing is keeping Moscow afloat, at least symbolically. Trump and his advisors know this. They've often warned that China's financial support could undermine U.S. sanctions and prolong the war. That's one reason why Trump's upcoming Asia trip includes stops in South Korea, Japan, and a possible meeting with Xi Jinping. His goal seems to be building a regional consensus that discourages China from deepening its backing for Putin. But again, that's easier said than done. China sees Russia as a strategic buffer against U.S. power. As long as the war in Ukraine keeps Washington and NATO busy, Beijing has more breathing room in Asia. That brings us to the next big question. Could China use this moment to make its own move? Some analysts worry that if the Ukraine war escalates, especially if long-range U.S. missiles strike inside Russia, the ripple effects could reach the Indo-Pacific. Imagine this scenario. Russia faces new attacks deep inside its territory. Putin retaliates, NATO responds, and tensions spiral. Beijing could see that as an opportunity, a distraction that lets it act more aggressively in the South China Sea or even against Taiwan. Trump's advisors are well aware of that risk. That's why his statements about the Tomahawk missiles have been so carefully phrased. He hasn't officially approved the transfer. He's only said that Ukraine has the right to reclaim its lost territories. It's a way to pressure Putin without crossing the line into direct confrontation. Meanwhile, Russia's economy continues to weaken. Ukraine's drone and missile strikes have destroyed or damaged nearly 40% of Russia's refinery capacity, forcing Moscow to import fuel from Belarus. That's an extraordinary reversal. The world's largest energy exporter now struggling to meet domestic demand. Higher oil prices are hitting Russian consumers, inflation is climbing, and Moscow recently raised its value-added tax from 20% to 22%, essentially making ordinary Russians pay for the war. Trump sees an opportunity here. If he can tighten the screws on Russia's energy sector, either through market manipulation or coordinated pressure on buyers, he might force Putin to the table without firing a shot. But again, the challenge isn't the strategy, it's the execution. For Trump personally, this situation is about more than foreign policy. It's about legacy and leadership. If he can orchestrate even a partial ceasefire or open real peace talks, it would be a massive political victory. It would allow him to claim what no modern president has achieved, bringing an end to a major European war through negotiation instead of escalation. But if the meeting backfires, if Putin uses it to stall or divide the West, Trump could face the same criticism he did years ago, that he's too willing to trust authoritarian leaders. Trump's confidence in personal diplomacy is both his greatest asset and his biggest risk. He genuinely believes he can read people, make deals, and achieve outcomes that traditional diplomats can't. But international politics isn't a real estate negotiation. The stakes are far higher, and the incentives much more complex. So far, Trump's instincts have been mixed. His pressure on NATO to increase defense spending during his first term did, in fact, push Europe to contribute more. But his unpredictability also made allies nervous and occasionally emboldened adversaries. That duality still defines him today, bold and disruptive, but often unpredictable. So where does this all go from here? Trump's diplomatic path forward is narrow, but not impossible. If he can use a mix of pressure, incentives, and face-to-face negotiation to push both sides toward a ceasefire, the world would welcome it. But peace requires trust, and right now, there's very little of that to go around. Ukraine insists that it will never cede its territories. Russia insists that those territories are now part of Russia, and the U.S. and Europe remain stuck between moral support and practical limits. For Trump, The coming months will test whether his unconventional approach can produce real results, or whether it's just another round of political theater. Either way, the stakes couldn't be higher. The outcome of his diplomacy will shape not only Ukraine's future, but also America's credibility as a global leader. So, can Donald Trump really end the war in Ukraine? The honest answer is, maybe, but not alone. The war has become a tangled web of military stalemate, economic warfare, and political posturing. Ending it will take more than charisma or tough talk. It will require coordinated diplomacy, sustained pressure, and genuine compromises that neither side seems ready to make. Still, the fact that Trump is trying, reaching out to Putin, engaging NATO, pushing India and Japan, and preparing to confront China, shows he's serious about reshaping U.S. foreign policy. Whether that effort succeeds or backfires will depend on one thing: whether all the players involved believe peace serves their own interests better than war does. And that, as history shows, is never an easy sell. So what do you think? Can Trump really pull off a peace deal? Or is this just political showmanship on the world stage? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this analysis helpful, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss future deep dives into global politics and U.S. foreign affairs. Thanks for watching. I'm Steve, and I'll see you in the next one.